Good morning. My name is Brittain Ashford. I'm the Executive Director of the Music Publishers Association. I'm very pleased to be with you all today for our panel, Canon Next. And I think everyone in this room is acutely aware of how the musical landscape has shifted over the last few years for performers and composers alike. While meaningful change has felt incremental, bordering on glacial, I think there's every reason to be optimistic about contemporary composers finding an audience for new work. In December, the Metropolitan Opera announced that they would reach into their endowment to embrace the works of living composers, not necessarily because of some ideological shift, but because they discovered that living composers were outselling the classics, or as we know it, the canon. So today we're here to talk about an evolving canon and about how new voices can be empowered and supported. This is a big topic, something I think we will only begin to scratch the surface of, but I am so pleased to welcome our panelists here to have the conversation. So to my left, we have Michael R. Dudley, Jr., who is an assistant professor of music and jazz studies at SUNY Potsdam, Crane School of Music in upstate New York. Composer, trumpeter, and educator, he has developed a career that defies conventions of genre. As a composer, he's also earned the 2022 ASCAP Herb Alpert Young Jazz Composer Award and was recently named a finalist for the San Francisco Symphony Emerging Black Composers Project. Welcome, Michael. Yeah, we can clap. Everyone here is a little shy about talking about themselves, and so it is my absolute pleasure to talk about them. But there's so many things I want to talk about that I can only begin to get into it. So brief introductions on all. Next we have Stephen Lankenau. Stephen is the Senior Vice President at Boosey & Hawkes, the largest specialist classical music publisher company in the world. And prior to getting into publishing, he was working with the Brooklyn Philharmonic, developing premieres and collaborative efforts with non-classical composers, including bands, theatrical directors, and dance companies. And then last, we have Joel Thompson, who is currently a composer in residence for the Houston Grand Opera and the New Haven Symphony Orchestra. Also a conductor and educator, Joel has collaborated with the New York Philharmonic, Atlanta Symphony Orchestra, and really, truly, too many to name. His work, Seven Last Words of the Unarmed, won the 2018 American Prize for Choral Composition. And these are our wonderful panelists to have this conversation with us today. Please give them a warm welcome. Again, we're only going to begin to scratch the surface on this, so in your own words from each of you, just a small insight to your journey. I realize asking you to encompass how you got here today is a very large question, but just in brief, how do you find yourself here today?
I'll start. I studied commercial music production at the University of Cincinnati College Conservatory of Music. And in that way, I feel like I was sort of non-traditional, but apparently not as non-traditional as Joel, as you'll find out. And I was always interested in composition and composing, but at that time, I certainly didn't have the tools to really realize what my dreams and visions were in that way, and I'm still gaining access to those tools. But yeah, so I studied music production, and then I realized that I didn't want to be a live sound engineer because personally I feel like that was a very difficult job. And so I decided to study jazz trumpet performance for graduate school, and after I went to the Frost School of Music in Miami, I then kind of rediscovered my love for composition and for orchestration, got to do some work for the Henry Mancini Institute Orchestra there, and from then I kind of just grew into the person that I'm continuing to grow to be. So yeah, that's my journey.
Awesome. Stephen?
Yeah, I studied to be a composer at the University of Wyoming, which is a hotbed of musical composition. I realized pretty early on in my journey that I probably wasn't going to have a professional career. I just didn't have, the CV for it. And I realized that there was sort of there was an inside track. And so before the Brooklyn Phil, I worked at Lincoln Center, and part of my goal has always been to sort of champion living composers because, first of all, as a living composer, you're at a disadvantage because we like the music of dead people an awful lot more. Maybe not the people in this room. So championing living composers and then sort of making sure that the living composers that are getting performed are from a broader range of sources than did they go to a conservatory, did they then go to Aspen or Tanglewood, did they then win an ASCAP or BMI award? There's just sort of like this track, and those are the people who would then get the first orchestra commissions, which led to additional orchestra commissions, which led to a big teaching post, and they all went to the same like 5 or 6 schools. And so I wanted to look a little bit further and deeper, and and people who came from other realms and sort of just sort of blossomed. And I do work for a music publisher, but in some ways that's actually also just composer management. It is working with composers, helping them find commissions, managing their schedule, making sure that they're thinking about actually like can they create the number of works that they've just promised to create in a year? For those composers in the room, there's a tendency to say yes to everything. And so my journey was sort of very quickly going from, I want to be a composer to I want to help composers. So that's how I'm here today.
There's a lot about what you shared that resonated with me. Let's see, my journey. Well, I started out in undergrad as a pre-med major, piano as well, and got into a music festival, probably one of the ones you're thinking of as you're mentioning that. After my senior year, I was still debating between music and medicine, but while I was there, I was a composition fellow there, and a piece of music was read but then laughed at by a conductor at the reading session, and then I realized as the only black composer at that festival that maybe composition wasn't for me. And so then I switched to choral conducting and did a master's in that after a gap year. And then I taught college choir and high school and middle school choir for the next 4 years. But while I was doing that, I wrote 7 Last Words of the Unarmed. At the premiere, Andre Dowell was playing the drums for Glory that followed it after Eugene had programmed that. And he then approached me afterwards and said, the 20th anniversary of Sphinx is happening next year. Would you, have you written for orchestra? Would you be willing to orchestrate it? I had never written for orchestra, and so I said, yes, I'll do it.
Good answer.
Yeah. And Sphinx has been essential part of this journey because the recording that I got from that performance was on an application to Aspen, which I attended in 2017, met Christopher Theophanides. He invited me to apply to Yale. I've been at Yale for the last 4 years, and now I'm composer in residence at Houston Grand Opera. There's a lot of timing, a lot of luck, a lot of what? No. Yes, but it's interesting that you mentioned the specific pipeline and the 5 schools and the festival thing, and how I just somehow sort of just hopped into that same pipeline that I had no intention of really jumping into. But yeah, it's a little inequitable, but I'm still very grateful to be where I am.
And I absolutely did not mean to call you out.
Well, it was not just that, it was also the getting pieces ready on time.
I think this proves to illustrate that there is no one path, there's no right path. Obviously, if we are thinking about how we foster composers and who is in our next canon of greats, supporting creative geniuses is important. And I think we all agree that community, Sphinx included, plays a tremendous role in the advancement of any composer's career. Are there specific communities or organizations or mentors that you can think about throughout your career that really helped guide you, aside from Sphinx?
Guess I'll start again. Working back from the Sphinx organization, because I have to say I probably wouldn't be here if I hadn't also ran into Andre, and actually Afa heard a piece that I wrote for an ensemble called the New Canon Chamber Collective a couple of years ago, and after that I became a part of this wonderful community. So I first want to give a shout out to Sphinx for that. But working backwards, definitely I feel like I was supported a lot by my teachers, my peers, my classmates at the University of Miami. And then kind of skipping from graduate school all the way to high school, just the community. And also I do want to make a point to say that the institutions that I attended were predominantly white, even down to elementary school. I grew up in the suburbs. I didn't recognize the effect that would have on me, and I still feel like I'm processing that, and I don't think that it's, always has to be a negative effect. But yeah, so in that way, a lot of my mentors have not been black or people of color, and that's been something that I've been kind of processing. But yeah, I'm very grateful to have a lot of teachers and mentors in my life.
Do you feel your mentors early on, or even like through college, are you still connected with those communities of people?
Absolutely, yeah. I still talk with my trumpet teacher, Brian Lynch. We used to talk every week until this semester last semester when I started my tenure track job, so things kind of got like a little bit busy with me. But yeah, so I still stay connected with as many people as possible, and I'm also learning how important that is just like on a personal human perspective, because now that I live in a town of like 6,000 people, I'm realizing that it's very important to not just talk and maintain relationships with the people that have helped you along the way, but also cultivate relationships with the people who are in your immediate surroundings, and realize that you can offer them something and they have something to offer you as well.
Absolutely.
What was the question again?
Talking about just communities that you felt helped advance your career or just help you get to where you are now, be it school or mentors or family, church institutions that helped sort of like buoy you.
Yes, my family, for sure, a very musical family. My parents met making music. My dad was in a little amateur band in Jamaica, and my mom was a soprano, and they met at like a open mic night. And he was the only person in his band who knew the song that my mom wanted to sing, and exchanged numbers, and I happened. So yeah, music in my family, definitely. They've always, they wanted me to be a doctor, to be to be honest. The choice to do music was much to their chagrin, but they came around. I also had lots of support from my college community. My piano teacher, because I was largely self-taught when I got into undergrad, and my first piano teacher there, Dr. Laura Cordy, just stripped away all of my horrible technique and built me up, and then said, "You have the hands appropriate for Rachmaninoff and Stravinsky," and started playing some new music that I wasn't really aware of, and then that got me on the composition path. So I'm really grateful for her guidance, and then also for the friends around me. Some of my first compositions were I had a penchant, because as a broke student, I didn't have money to buy friends' birthday gifts. So I had a habit of turning my friends' names into solfege in sort of like a cryptogram sort of way. Some people have more, musical names than others, but make a little motif out of their names and then make a prelude for their instrument or something using their names. and that sort of that practice of musical portraiture probably definitely influenced my opus 1 of Seven Last Words of the Unarmed, where I'm trying to capture the essence of these men and honor their humanity.
It's also way better than like a coffee mug or something.
True. I mean, I would like to get a prelude based on my name. Yeah, I'm grateful for the community around me, my friends that were, willing to tolerate all of my practicing compositions for them.
Awesome. I'm trying to get a feel of who we have in the room, because some of the questions are geared towards folks who are just starting out, and obviously some very seasoned professionals in here. At what point, this is a very broad question, and this is for everyone, a question of success. Like, we're talking about the canon and like how you feel you are moving towards it or moving away from it or part of it or not part of it for that matter. So I guess thinking about success, what your success feels like or what it means to you in general. Do you feel like you're hitting a mark? Do you feel like you're getting where you want to go? Or the answer could also be no, but yeah, I guess that's it. Just do you feel like you've arrived at a point that's either a starting point or not?
I think I'm still redefining what success looks like for me as more opportunities become available, and other opportunities seem like the doors might be closing on them. I am grateful that I am becoming older, but I'm now reaching the threshold where I might not be considered young by like certain applications for certain programs, and that's been a hard thing for me to contend with because I only started composing like in earnest maybe 3 years ago. And even though I have been involved with certain kinds of like I've been to Aspen, but it wasn't for like the Aspen Music Festival, it's for the Jazz Aspen Snowmass thing. So in that way, I've been successful as a performer, but now I'm seeing my life as a composer and as a teacher after reading my course evaluations. Success maybe means something different, I guess.
That's great. I was going to say, Stephen, you can also chime in on this.
Well, while you think of what to say, I think I'm contending with, I guess, multiple definitions of success. I think by some metrics, I have achieved some modicum of success in this space, and I'm grateful for that. But then I'm constantly asking at what cost? How am I increasingly more complicit in systems that I'm hoping to dismantle, or hoping to open wider the door so that it's a more equitable space. I don't want success to be opening a door into a space and then closing it behind me. Or to be absorbed into a gatekeeping mechanism simply because my art is somehow considered palatable and becomes absorbed into a status quo. I'm constantly trying to figure that out. But I know that personally, the metrics of success for me are, especially since my craft, I think, the aim is self-exploration, self-discovery. If there's a bad review or an audience doesn't like it, that doesn't matter to me as much as if it's as honest as possible, whatever I write. And I've had some pieces where I could look back and say that it wasn't quite as honest, or it felt like I was pretending to be something that I wasn't. And those I withdraw and make sure those aren't performed again. But yeah, I think I'm contending with those two definitions of success, I think, right now in my career.
And I think it can always be changing. And I think as an artist, I think our definition of success changes frequently. It's the idea of, you climb a mountain, and what do you do when you get to the top of the mountain? You're like, oh, there's another mountain over there. So I think it's always evolving.
Just following up on Brittain's question about people in this room, I'm just curious, like, how many of you identify as composers? Raise hands. Oh, desire to. And yeah, and then how many of you are performers? This is a lot of performers. And then administrators? Okay, so this is a room of a lot of performers. And a parent of a composer. So one thing that I was trying to think about what means success to the composers that I work with, and actually you sort of struck a chord completely separate of what I was thinking about. And you reminded me of Audra McDonald. You just reminded me of Audra McDonald in general. But when she accepted her award, her Musical America Artist of the Year award in 2013 or 2014, in part of her speech, she talked about the artists who had come before her who had opened doors and kept those doors open for her to be able to go through, and that one of her goals was, now that she got where she was going to get, to make sure that door was kept open for everyone else to get through. And I think that's a definition of success. It's not related to like artistic merit necessarily, but it's related to her having stature and power and the ability to actually ensure that other people are getting roles that weren't. And so that's a definition of success that's actually really wonderful and not related to sort of like, did she win another Tony? But I think, for composers, there is, and you mentioned going up mountains, there's a lot of different sized mountains. So for some composers, it's really just getting a work performed. Getting a work performed by a professional organization. That can be success. If that same person then says, okay, now I want to get it performed by the New York Philharmonic, or I want it performed at the Met, that's a different level of success, and that might be harder for them to achieve. And there are incremental steps from getting that first professional performance, to that major, New York Times review. So I would say like success is very individual, and some composers can make a living from composition. It's not common, but it happens. Other composers are just happy to be financially compensated for their writing. And I think as we're like trying to like think about like, okay, we want to create the 21st century canon and get new music out there. I think there's room for all of that. The professional organizations need new works, but so do the amateur organizations. Something that's being done in a church basement could use an infusion of new art. So the success can happen on all of those different levels.
I feel like you touched on like 4 different things that I want to like move into. And one of them, I know we talked about it last night, the idea of saying yes, and this want to say yes to all the exciting opportunities as they present themselves, and knowing when to say no. So I think this is a question for everyone. How do you know when to say yes, and how do you know, more importantly, when to say no? Or if you don't, that's okay too.
I feel like I'm the worst person to ask, because I still think I'm on this journey of learning when to say no. I never want to be, I guess, in a situation in which, right now there are conversations with my team and some people who are sort of mentoring me at this stage of my career, of saying no to things that don't fit a certain level of profile or something. or heading in the direction of, the typical ascending arc of a compositional career. And if a high school orchestra wants a 5-minute piece about X, Y, and Z, I should say no to that and say yes to the larger organization, and there's something sad to me about that. I don't ever want to, I want to be able to interact with, in order to keep that door open, representation matters. Being a part of music education initiatives matter. It can be very lonely, especially as a Black composer in this space, and to completely ignore music education and the things that we can do as representatives of this art form would be to essentially keep the door just as closed. So I think that's why I'm the wrong person to ask, because I want to say yes to all of those things, because the space will remain inequitable if I don't. And I don't want to invite someone into a space that's torturous just because of I'm supposed to, So I think I may have complicated matters, but that's all.
I think this is actually a nice segue to say, how, if it's not you, then who, and how do we get more people to sort of acknowledge, especially like early music education, because that is really where our musicians, be they composers or performers, it starts traditionally at a young age, that interest, that drive, that passion, and how do we instill that to inform this next generation, our next canon? I don't have an answer for that, but as educators, do either of you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, kind of going back to one of the things I said earlier about making sure that you cultivate relationships with your surrounding community. So if you are part of a school at any level, it's important to, I would say, I would suggest that you engage the people around you. If there's someone who says that they are a composer, they want to be a composer, then why can you not go about programming, or at least offering to program their music, or at least offering to read their music? It doesn't even have to make a concert. Like you said, some people would be happy just to have their stuff read. I mean, I've been asking myself why I write music as I've started to write more music and make sure that I am writing music for other people, but not for other people, if that makes any sense.
Yes.
And so to the first for other people, like, we have to remind ourselves as presenters, as curators, as administrators, that we're working with other people, and if there's somebody who's interested in an opportunity, that should be, depending on the opportunity, yes, but that should be enough of a qualification to at least entertain the idea of working with them. Because that's the only way that you'll subvert the systems that are gatekeeping, is to just say that there's no gate. And sometimes that means that you take the risk of letting in people that you're like, oh, maybe that didn't really work out. But if we have to allow ourselves to make mistakes in that way as well.
Any other thoughts on this specific?
Yeah, if you think about Noah's Ark, and the idea that like only two of each kind are allowed on board, that's sort of like what music programming is. We already have a woman on our season. We already have the music of Latin America concert. So we just don't have any more room. There's no more room. We already have that. That is an old model, but that is the model that a lot of professional organizations used for very, very many years. And as you just said, like, the only way to do it is to just get rid of the gate. So right now, there's sort of this kind of messy situation where some organizations have actually just totally removed the gate, and they have no idea what they're doing, and they're sort of like letting all these animals in. And the programming, you look at the season, and it's like this sort of like, sort of like messiness of like, the concerts don't necessarily all make sense together, but they're really, really trying. And maybe it's because they're going to realize that some of this music isn't right for their organization, but they at least tried it. And so they'll try to figure it out. And maybe it's not right for that organization, but it'll be right for a different organization. And they gave that artist exposure that's going to let other people know that piece and that piece exists and is out there, and it needs to be out there. I think exposure is key here, and that you writing a piece for a high school orchestra may tell people in that orchestra that composers can be black, which is not what they're going to see in their Grout, Poliska history of Western music.
Yeah, we don't do that in high school.
Yeah, sorry, I got a little bit ahead of myself there, but but like it's just not what is studied, and so that's an interesting way of you saying like, yeah, sure, I'll write a piece for a professional orchestra, but I always want to make room in my schedule for a non-professional organization, even if the money isn't there. That is part of like, and maybe I'll take some of these high-level things, to make sure that I have enough money so that I can take this, which is not going to be able to pay, but I want to make sure that at some huge high school band conference, they perform my piece, and like thousands and thousands of students, see a black composer on stage. That has a huge power, So I think that's kind of a cool idea. So I'm not on your team, so I'm not encouraging it, but I'm not discouraging it either.
I think at this time, are there any questions from the audience?
We do have one question on the Hopin app to start off the Q&A session. This is from Ariel Bazil. As an organization that runs a competition for young composers aged 18 to 30, no fee to submit, we've had mixed success getting the word out, even in our 5th year. Is there anything our panelists would recommend we do to help reach young composers more broadly and effectively?
That's a great question, and I know that with the Music Publishers Association, that's something we have also struggled with when we're trying to attract just young people, not necessarily composers specifically, but for other things that are of interest to, I think, young composers and musicians. And I think it's hard. I think that there's no one way to connect with any particular audience. I think it's time and it's money. So it's to get an email list that's going to go out to administrators, but administrators are also very busy. Teachers are very busy. So I think it ultimately ends up being a lot of word of mouth. And I think it's time. It's just the accumulation. So I would tell whoever submitted that question to you're trying, you're doing it, and keep doing that.
I would just echo that the word of the mouth is key, and that composers are a community and they know each other. And so if they begin to learn that there's a competition that is worth entering, they will start saying like, oh, I'd love to go out tonight, but I have to like finish up my piece for that competition. And then the other composer was like, oh yeah, I was thinking about entering that, I should do that too. And it starts gaining momentum. There are a number of residencies, fellowships, competitions that like every young composer starts to learn that like they should try to enter. And so your goal should be like, how do I get enough composers to talk about the thing I'm doing so that they kind of like all are talking about it?
Cool. Should we take a question from the pad or from, please, no.
Hi, hello. Hi, my name is Tyler Adamthwaite. I'm here with Buffalo Stringworks as a teaching artist. I also compose, arrange, and do just all sorts of various things for them in addition to being in my final year of my PhD in composition. And I've gotten some backlash from my department at the university about my work with Stringworks, about going out into the community and playing. So I just Was wondering what you guys all think about the composer and model as opposed to the more traditional, like, composer needs to go get that tenure track position model.
I guess to be an example as an answer, the end of next month, I will be going on tour with this group called the Maria Schneider Orchestra. And in addition to that, like, I still have a couple commissions to finish, and I have a full-time job. So I am the composer and model. Right now, I've been talking with some of my friends here, just who are in a similar stage where we're trying to figure out that pie chart of our lives. Where, like, how much of this, and this goes back to the yes and no question. For me, and this is probably true for all of us to a certain extent, until recently, probably, I would just say yes to everything because I felt like that was all I was ever going to get. And I think that you shouldn't, maybe you shouldn't necessarily listen to those people who tell you that you're only going to be successful if you stick to that one thing. Because if you're interested in doing other things, then you should just do what you're interested in. So,
I find it interesting that there are so many examples within the canon, as problematic as it is, of composers who didn't just compose, but did lots of other things, and yet you're feeling pressure to stick to this one thing when that's just not even historically how it goes. Everyone in this room said they're a performer, then everyone said they're an administrator, then everyone said they're a composer. Like, you are surrounded by lots of ands. So I think it's impractical. And there's also economic factors at play. With this inflation, you can't just be one thing. So yeah, what they said.
Next question.
Yes, from an anonymous. As a new composition student, are there new careers on the horizon for composers? And what is the field trending toward?
So what I would say is, so back in the days of yore, pre-pandemic, people tended to program kind of conservatively, and they were cautious with their commissions. And so they'd say, okay, we'd like to commission something, but we want to make sure that we have the funding, so we're going to apply for this grant. If we get the grant, then we'll ask the composer. Or, hey, we're looking at a commission for the 26-27 season, maybe a 10-minute opener. And so, like, they were just planning, like, years and years ahead and, like, thinking about the grant. And then the pandemic destroyed all their seasons. Between Me Too and Black Lives Matter, everyone started saying, well, and we have all the wrong ideas. And so everyone started scrambling. And during the pandemic, people started putting on, like, streaming concerts that they had programmed, like, 6 weeks in advance. Professional organizations were scrambling and, like, asking us for music because they were just like, we just decided we're doing Appalachian Spring right now. And so, organizations, professional organizations specifically, are beginning to like slow down again and to be more thoughtful. But there's an opportunity right now for more young composers, more composers who haven't had a lot of opportunities, more composers who have hadn't been part of the mainstream pipeline to sort of get their voices heard. To echo very quickly sort of the stuff we talked about at the very, very beginning with community, some of the best ways to do that is to just find community. At this conference, for example, in this very room, there happens to be a very good professional violinist. And may or may not, if a composer approached her and said, would you be willing to look at my score? May or may not have time, but that is a chance and a choice you should make as a composer. When you're backstage and you meet a conductor, when you are, at a choir concert, if you have a chance to talk to the choir director, if you approach them politely, professionally, and you just ask, and you don't shove it in their face, and you don't have expectations, they'll often say, oh, that'd be really great, can follow up with me, or follow up with my assistant, or, DM me, and then maybe they will. And you can start building those opportunities. And now for the first time, there's actually a chance, like, people are taking more risks with composers. So there's actually a chance that, like, even though you just did this crazy thing and gave a piece to a violinist you barely knew, there's actually a chance that that violinist will then say, like, this piece is great and I'm going to take it on the road because I don't want to perform Beethoven anymore.
Yeah. And I think it's also an important thing to remember is that when you ask for what you want politely, it might not work 99 out of 100 times, but that 1 out of 100 times, if it's the right time and place, then that's how the magic happens.
Hi, I'm Jane Lindemood. I am the orchestra director in Dodge City, Kansas. I teach 6th through 12th grade, 6th grade beginners, all 7 years.
Bless you.
Thank you. I want to thank you for even mentioning high school and elementary education. It hasn't, this is not necessarily a conference that's pointed at that, but as you noted, it is essential if this is going to continue. So I would beg you, please take those high school works. Women in general are doing pretty well with, if I sat here, I could name 6, 8 women composers that have multiple high school, middle school pieces, teaching works that get recycled over and over again. I can't come up with minority BIPOC names off the top of my head in the middle school, high school canon. And we need you. We need you desperately to take those, to do Zoom in or other internet remote visits. My high school is 70% Hispanic, 17% white, and the balance a mix of Black and API and other BIPOC cultures. I don't look like my kids. They need to see you. I need to be able to fold back that first page of my conductor's score and hold up your picture and say, this person looks like you, and you can do this too.
This sounds like a great job for the Music Publishers Association to harass.
I was looking at
all
you next.
Look, I do it on a regular meeting basis. I'm going to say at this point is maybe 60% of my job is.
So I'm sorry, that was more statement than question, but I wanted to thank you for bringing it up.
Thank you. We probably have time for one more question.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Marlo Staples. I'm very intrigued about this topic of Noah's Ark and the concept of programming. And I would like to know what your thoughts are if you could slot yourself into a program genre side. Who would you want your pieces to sit alongside? Kind of a caveat to that. I also think of programming kind of like a course menu. Like, what course would your piece be within this kind of program?
I love this question.
Thank you.
Gentlemen. No pressure.
I like when organizations put a lot of thought into how they program my music. Sometimes it can sort of reinforce the sort of tokenistic vibe of like, it's here just because it's February or something, or at the same time, I would love for lots of orchestras to have a sort of gender parity sort of model, but while also thematically structuring their concerts in a way that it's edifying for an audience, it's a part of storytelling. Effective programming won't feel like it's a sort of hodgepodge thing, but there's a sort of natural arc that will make each piece shine in the way it should. It's hard when I think you've just stated that the industry is in a sort of scramble and trying to just check boxes as, the light is being shown on the inequities that are, have been festering in our industry for decades, centuries. And so I'm hoping that we are in this time when we realize that these pieces of art are not just to fulfill identities, but to truly reflect the community that is in attendance. If you have the city in the title of your organization, maybe your programming should reflect the entirety of the demographics that's in your city. And there are people of so many cultures and races and genders and identities. Why not have that reflected in your programming? And also, on top of that, I know it's a lot, but tell stories, you know? Have people be seen. And I think the hunger that you mentioned that the Met Opera is responding to at the very beginning of this panel, hopefully we will see that in the concert hall space. Hopefully we will see the majority, hopefully, of pieces in a concert at an orchestra hall being written within the last 20 years. That would be amazing. But it's going to take some courage on the parts of administrators and communities alike just to try and make that happen.
Sorry, I would just want to very much agree with your point to the extent that I will say that we have to be careful not to continue to like encourage this ossification of programming, because in doing so, then no wonder we're going to say like, why isn't there anything new that we can listen to? It's, well, because you don't hear it, because, and the only context in which you hear it is compared to, you know, Bach and Beethoven and all of these wonderful composers and pieces that were hundreds of years ago. There are people alive today who are writing music that is probably within similar or the same kinds of styles that sound equally as good. So why don't we lift those people up and say that they were, and also talk about those people's influences. Like, for instance, I'm very much influenced by Sergei Prokofiev, who also was a pianist and premiered his own works. And so in that way, you know, why can't we program, not specifically my music, but just as an example, like why can't my music be performed alongside Sergei Prokofiev, and then we have a discussion about these composers and the performers and the works and the influences and the community and all of it. So.
That's great.
Hi, thanks for a great discussion. My name is Mark Clegg. I'm from the University of Michigan, a musicologist. And working with some colleagues, Louise Toppin and Naomi Andre and others, along with many of our current students on a project called Singing Justice. And the notion is specifically to sort of attack the way the canon of musical masterworks is taught in higher education. And so I wanted to build upon your comment you just made and Joel's comment earlier about being complicit in the system as you're trying to you know, dismantle the system at the same time, and just ask you if anybody has some reflections on the notion of canon and just whether, is that a productive idea? Should we, you know, at times I think we should blow it up. At times I think we should be fixing it, and at times I think we should be expanding it. And I'm just sort of curious, given that that's in the title of the session, if you guys have mused on that notion, if you have any insights.
You know, Mark, thank you for that question. That is actually the closing question. So that's great, but we can.
Can't skip Daniel's.
I think it's because it's a big hairy ball. I think is the question is, does the idea of a canon service in 2023? And gentlemen.
Okay, I tend to think of canon as sometimes as a synonym of mythology. I think of like Greek mythology, all of these stories of the gods on Mount Olympus and holding a mirror up to the foibles of human nature through this sort of superimposing that onto stories of divine beings that make mistakes and do things and learn from them, moral plays and all of that. And I think of the mythology of American history and how we have a very sanitized version of what has led to this point. And any efforts to shine light on things that are uncomfortable about our history, that are excluded from the American historical canon, I suppose, are usually met with violence or running away. I think that the fact that American schools of music are called schools of music, but only specialize in Western European music from 1750 to 1900 is, and we are here in America whose early music was sung by enslaved people, and spirituals and work songs that is the early music of this country, and we don't study that in our schools of music here. I think there is a mythology that is being taught, and I would appreciate a canon that is truthful. I would appreciate a canon that is based on fact, that is representative of the country's ever-evolving identity. And just as the identity of this country is continually evolving, so should our canon, so should the story we tell ourselves about ourselves. That then becomes the foundation of a culture that leaves room for itself to continue to grow and expand and check itself and move towards equity. Maybe that is not a canon. Maybe we need another name for this thing. But I think that's what I would prefer rather than the lies we've been telling ourselves. Yeah, I think that's my general response.
It's great, yeah.
I see canon as, in a productive way, I see it as structure, because it's necessary to have structure and a frame for the way that we see the world. And in that way, I see the canon as being necessary. However, I guess when I'm teaching a jazz history course right now, and I'm using a textbook, and every single name and kind of fact, I invite the students to interrogate. And that makes for, a class that hopefully lasts a lot longer than a semester, but at the same time, we have to continue to cultivate critical thinking, which I think we're in danger of failing to keep that up. So I think that the canon can both exist and not exist at the same time.
Schrodinger's cat. Schrodinger's canon.
Hi, my name is Daniel Kamapai. I had two questions, kind of going back to programming. One, which is kind of focusing on the curriculum within music education, but also grade levels. So I'm Nigerian, I've worked with a lot of Nigerian composers, and some things that I've kind of seen when I was student teaching in Ann Arbor, I've often seen where people maybe they'll do I remember my teacher, she went to Kenya and she came back and she taught us this folk song from Kenya. But I've seen also maybe in J.W. Pepper, where it would be someone who maybe isn't of diverse background writing a diverse piece. I know a specific case is Larry Clark, where he had the impersonation name Keiko Yamada. So I was thinking, in music education, is it more so we want diverse pieces by diverse composers, or we just want diverse pieces? Because going back to the curriculum, I think for me, seeing Nigerian composers' works, I question if it's too progressive. Some ideas I've had is looking at the curriculum we teach, kind of let's say you want to teach your kids how to play on the E string, if you want to teach your kids how to play on slur, trying to take their pieces and implement it through that that lens, so that way it's more, I guess, digestible for people. And I also, grade levels too, I sometimes wonder if it's creating a barrier, because I know sometimes even grade 0.5, grade 1, grade 3.5. So for me, when I try to, sometimes I feel am I hurting Nigerian composer trying to teach them how to write? Because to me it feels very Eurocentric, I don't know, very, very structured. And I think for a lot of Nigerian composers, it's more organic and more exposure. And I think not even Nigerian composers, I think there could be composers anywhere in the world, kind of outside the US. So yeah, that's my question.
I would say, and this is actually continuing with something that Joel said, is that like one of the things that I've been grappling with recently is that, yeah, like what we call music when we study music in schools is European, but it's not even just European. It's really like from like a handful of countries, and like we call it music, and you know, right now we're having all these conversations about like, well, how do we get more people involved in music? And it's like, wait, hold on, you know, like what you mean is, how do we get more people involved in like European culture music? Because actually, there's a whole bunch of healthy, robust music things happening already in the United States and internationally. So like, it's a really good question because, and then going back to what you said about like, you know, there's choral music that was actually arranged by some really good choral director, but it's, you know, using some Kenyan folk song, or it's using a Korean folk song, and it's like, you know, so-and-so choral director, lovely arrangement of this Korean folk song, and then like, back even like 10 years ago, we didn't think twice about that. We were like, well, she's a great choral director, so what's the big deal? And now we're suddenly like, what on earth is she doing? Like, what? And so I think, you know, as a publisher, it's sort of like there's a little bit of a mea culpa there, where we're like, it's our bad. We should have known better than that. But also like now, you know, my colleagues who do choral music and band music and education music, their responsibility is to go out and to find, you know, the appropriate people to create this music, and then to bring it to print and to make it available the same way that music had been made available earlier, you know, sort of like, so that when you go to Hal Leonard, you can see, you know, like, oh, appropriate for grade 3, this lovely folk song, and then you can see that it's like, it has been put together by somebody who actually knows what that folk song is about, what the point is, what the background of teaching it was, and then can actually therefore help teachers, you know, teach that song in the correct way to the students. I'm not an educator, so I can't go into the full detail of, you know, I don't have the full knowledge of all the different levels that you talked about, but I would say that like there were definitely mistakes made, and I think now there's a responsibility to actually sort of do this in a thoughtful, appropriate manner, and it, you know, yeah.
We have just a few more minutes left. I think we have 2 more minutes left here. So I guess closing thoughts. There's so many great questions, I'm sure, in the audience, but also some questions I had written down that we didn't really have the time to get to, and also we're just sort of scratching the surface. It's like the idea of it. I guess closing thoughts, words of advice, sage little snippets in 45 seconds or less. Mine would be ask for what you want, and you deserve it.
I think, I don't know why I just like lunged for the microphone. I'm still trying to put my thoughts into words, but going back to that last question, I feel like I have to tell myself that not everything is for me. And even as a Black person, like being interested in other cultures and as well as my own, you know, like telling myself that has invited me to get to know myself and my identity more. And I feel like if more people did that and stopped, like I do feel to a certain extent that musical appropriation is definitely a thing. And if more people like ask themselves that before they decided they would go, you know, arrange like Korean folk songs or something like that, if they just ask themselves that, I'm not saying that they shouldn't do that, but just to kind of see, you know, what are the elements of your background that you could be proud of and should be proud of and celebrate before you attempt to celebrate someone else's culture, I suppose. I'm personally experiencing this as someone who's become very much interested in different Native American cultures and nations, and something that I've learned by like attending panels and stuff like that is like, this is not my, it's not my shit. Like, and I have to respect that. And I think that if we all did that same thing, then there would be more space for all of us to exist musically and otherwise. But it's really hard for everyone to get to that same place of like owning your own truth. So yeah, that's my closing thought, I suppose.
Thank you.
Yeah, we are definitely just scratching the surface. I do think of music as can be an invitation for empathy. It can be a way for us to interact with each other and not necessarily remain siloed in our identities. If I had to rely on only people who match my identity performing my music, then there would be so many missed opportunities for connection. At the same time, those moments, if we really want a true exchange of ideas, it needs to happen within an equitable system. So when we are trying to do this in a situation in which we are in a system that reinforces hierarchy, we're not able to actually have a one-to-one exchange because, people aren't allowed to share their own voices because it's an inequitable system. Like you mentioned with the sort of you trying to interact with Native American song, we need like another hour to talk about this. But at the same time, I don't want to shortchange the power of music to allow us to see ourselves and each other more clearly. And the way that we do that, though, I think is just being honest in our creation. And that's one thing that I prioritize in my craft, in my music making. I want it to be as real to who I am in this moment as possible. And I guess that would be the thing I would close with, I suppose.
Stephen, anything?
Be nice, ask questions, take risks.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for being part of this. Thank you to Sphinx for having us for the session. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your time here. Thank you.